By June of 1944, things were looking much better for the Soviet Union. They had driven Army Group North, the German Army Group North, away from Leningrad, which is, unfortunately, I haven't had much time to talk about the siege of Leningrad in this course. There's so much to talk about. Um, the German army is certainly a shell of the army that had invaded Russia in June of 1941, but it was still a very, very potent force. And the other thing is, German soldiers fought fanatically for a couple of reasons. One, Germany was like the Soviet Union in the sense that if you were a deserter, you would be hung, you would be killed. The Germans became just as ruthless as the Soviets against soldiers that didn't want to fight. But I think more importantly, German soldiers had an understanding of what would happen once the Soviets came into Germany, that there would be retribution for what had happened, the massive, unspeakable atrocities that occurred in the Soviet Union after the German invasion in 1941. So the German army actually is fighting quite fanatically against the Soviet army for a number of reasons. And it's still, bottom line, is still a very, very potent force. So the Operation Bagration, as I talked about before, it is aimed at Army Group Center, and this is where the main Soviet blow would fall. When it focuses on Belarusia, which is north of Ukraine. And remember, you had a map test early in the semester where I had you identify Belarusia. It was the center of gravity for Germany's forces in the Soviet Union. Significantly, and we've talked about this, and Schneider talks about this, partisan activity on the part of the Soviets was extremely important and destabilizing to a certain extent the German army in this areas, in this area in Belarusia. And the Germans were quite ruthless in trying to stamp out partisan activity. In January through April 1944, the Germans had launched major operations against partisans, which left entire villages leveled. Inhabitants were lined up and executed. And you had this war within the war with Army Group Center in Belarusia, where you had up to 200,000. We really don't know how many partisan forces there were. By mid-1944, the German reprisals, though, had made the partisans fighting the Germans grow. And there's some estimates that there were more than 300,000 partisans fighting behind the German lines. By then, we really don't know for sure, but it was well into the hundreds of thousands, depending on who was counting. And these partisans were causing the Germans real headaches, the partisans that were fighting behind the German lines. First of all, they are in much better contact with Moscow. And so they're being directed by Moscow, they're being directed by the Soviet army, and the partisans are increasingly better armed and better organized. And they're being directed by the Soviet military authorities to do as much damage as they can do. And so what you have before Bagration in June of 1942, the partisans, and we've talked about this, and there was a documentary earlier in the semester, or they're blowing up railroad lines, they're disrupting German communications, and they're really wreaking havoc in Army Group Center, which turns out to be a significant role in the ultimate Soviet victory at Bagration. Now, our Army Group Center was not in great shape by June of 1944. There's a salient in Army Group Center, which was called the Belarusian Balcony. And what had happened is that after the defeats at Kursk and Stalingrad, or Stalingrad and Kursk, of Army Group South, Army Group Center had withdrawn and it held a defensive position, but this defensive was exposed. It was the largest army group along the front in the Soviet Union, the German army group. It had about 700,000 men, but it was in trouble. It stretched along a enormous area of the Soviet Union. So although it was the largest German army in the Soviet Union, it had to defend a tremendous amount of space. So it was very, very thinly spread. The Army Group Center was very, very thinly spread in the area of the Soviet Union that it was supposed to protect. And the Soviet military, the high command realized this, that the Army Group Center, although it was the largest army group in the Soviet Union, was spread very thin along an enormous front, hundreds of miles long. And so it was spread very, very thin. And so they decide, the Soviet Union, they decide that it's for the attack that Stalin had promised at the Tehran conference, that the attack against the Germans would come against Army Group Center. And they planned the Soviet military. They planned this attack. They had to convince Stalin that it was the right place to attack. Stalin wanted the Soviet army to attack Army Group South in the southern part of the Soviet Union, but his generals stood up to him. And he actually ordered them out of the room and said, "Hey, you guys want to think about this? Because I don't agree with this. I don't agree with this attack on Army Group Center." But the Soviet generals held firm, and they said, "Look, this is the best place for our troops to attack the German army. It's spread very thin, Army Group Center, and this is where we can have the most success." So Stalin, unlike Hitler, and I don't want to praise Stalin too much, because of course we know he's a blood-thirsty monster. Nonetheless, by 1944, he's listening to his generals, and he goes along with this attack on Army Group Center, which was not his preferred attack. The other thing that is happening is that the Germans are convinced that the Soviet Union is going to attack in the South, that it's going to be a continuation of the war that had started with the attack against Stalingrad and the defeat there, and then Kursk in 1943, and that the Soviets were going to attack the Germans. There was no doubt that there was going to be a Soviet offensive in 1944. But once again, the Germans screw it up. And this is helped in part by Soviet deception. The Germans, Hitler all the way down, are convinced that Army Group Center would not be subject to attack in 1944, in the summer of 1944, that the attack would occur against the Army Group South. And so what happens is Army Group Center, which is already very thinly spread out in the Soviet Union, it loses a large percent of its tanks. It loses a large percent of its infantry. It loses, and I'll give you some facts and again, don't think I'll quiz you on this, but just to give you a sense that Hitler's so convinced that the attack is not going to happen in the center that it loses 15% of its infantry divisions to other army groups in the Soviet Union. It loses a quarter of its assault guns, and it loses up to 75% of its artillery and tank strength. Pretty incredible. So right at the moment that the Soviet Union, and you only have apparently 6 Soviet generals planning this attack. Stalin kept it very, very secret. He knew that he was reading the German army's mail, and he didn't want the same thing to happen to the Soviet army. So you've got a very tiny group of generals planning this attack. So at the same time, the Soviets are starting to build up these huge reinforcements to attack Army Group Center in June of 1944. Army Group Center is losing a significant proportion of its infantry, its artillery, and its tanks. So the Germans make a major, major mistake in misreading the enemy's intentions. Probably the biggest mistake the Germans made in World War II. And think about it. This is at the same time that the Germans are convinced that the Allies that are invading France are going to invade at the Pas de Calais, not at the Normandy beaches. So in June of 1944, the Germans are tricked twice. They're tricked by the Americans and the British in the Normandy and the Overlord invasions of what is now known as D-Day. But they're also tricked in the Soviet Union, where the Soviets are planning this massive attack on Army Group Center, and the Germans just don't see it. They think the attack's going to go somewhere else, and they strip Army Group Center of a significant proportion of its infantry, its artillery, and its tanks. So once again, the Germans make really dumb mistakes in June of 1944, both at Normandy with the fake army that Patton was supposedly commanding, but also in the Soviet Union as well. And one of the points I'm making in this class that I want you to take from the class is the German army made a number of significant mistakes at the highest level. Especially after you could argue that the invasion of the Soviet Union was a big mistake as well. Now, that's not to say that the German army, the German soldiers on the ground didn't fight tactically very well. Tactically, the German army was probably the best army, but strategically, and in terms of the big decisions and deployments, the German army makes enormous amounts of mistakes. And in June of 1944, it made 2 huge miscalculations, very significant miscalculations, both in Normandy and on the Eastern Front.